Welcome to today's webinar. County Health Rankings and Roadmaps is a program of the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute with support from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. This webinar is produced in collaboration with Healthy Places by Design. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Daejeop since time immemorial. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. This webinar will be recorded. All speakers' views are their own. Guest bios and slides from today's webinar are available on our resource page. We will share a link to the resource page when the webinar begins. Stay up to date on all things CHR&R. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And if you haven't already, sign up for our newsletter by scanning this QR code with your phone's camera. It's the best way to find out about upcoming webinars, our podcast, and our latest tools and resources. Your facilitators today include our host, Erica Burrows-Girardi, with support from CHR&R Communications Specialist, Tommy Jaime, and the Collaborative Learning Director from Healthy Places by Design, Joanne Lee. We invite you to continue the conversation immediately after the webinar in our discussion group. Joanne Lee will be our lead facilitator. And watch for a chat from Tommy for details on how to join the group after the webinar.
Hi, welcome to the first webinar in a two-part series entitled Unjust and Unfair, Health Consequences of the Racial Wealth Divide. Hi, my name is Erica Burrows-Girardi. I am the Senior Outreach Specialist at County Health Rankings and Roadmaps. During this series, we will explore the reasons behind the wealth gap and solutions communities can implement to close it. Today's webinar is entitled Why Wealth Matters to Your Health. And I want to introduce you to some colleagues who will help aid in your learning experience today. I'm going to start with Joanne Lee with Healthy Places by Design. Hi, Joanne.
Hi, Erica, and hi, everybody out there joining us for the webinar today. As Erica mentioned, I'm Joanne Lee with Healthy Places by Design. We're proud to be a partner organization with County Health Rankings and Roadmaps in bringing this webinar as well as the following discussion group, which you'll hear more about. For today's webinar, I will be monitoring the Q&A box. So I encourage you, as you think of questions for our presenters today, go ahead and have the Q&A box ready, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can during today's webinar session. And then you can always bring additional questions to the discussion group. The other engagement tool that you'll be using today is the chat box, and Tommy Jaime with CHR&R is going to tell you how to use the chat box.
Thanks, Joanne, and hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you all, of course. And like Joanne said, I'll be chatting with you in the chat box today. And when chatting, please be sure to use the drop-down box and choose chat to everyone before you send your message. That way everyone can see your chat, and I'll kick off the chats today. Actually, if you have a question, please be sure to place it in the Q&A box where Joanne will help you out, like she said. And next up, I'd like to introduce James Lloyd. James is a colleague here at County Health Rankings and Roadmaps, and he'll be helping with technology. If you have any tech issues during the webinar, please let us know in the chat. Hey, James.
Hi, Tommy. I'm really glad to be here. I love these topics that we present, so I'm listening as long as I'm supporting too. I wanted to point out today also we have enabled subtitles, and so on the toolbar of your Zoom meeting there should be something that has the closed caption icon, and if it helps, you can turn on captioning while we are speaking today. So I'll watch the chat for any technical problems that I might observe, and with that, Erica, I will hand it back to you.
Thanks, James, and you and Erin are always so helpful. So thank you so much for supporting our webinars all the time. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic is the worst public health crisis in more than a century. and has disproportionately burdened certain communities and populations across the US, particularly women, people of color, seniors, and people with lower incomes. For many of you on this webinar today, you've dedicated your careers to advancing equity. And you know that before the pandemic, far too many people lived in places where access and opportunity rarely intersected. So now that communities across America are planning a recovery from the pandemic, we here at CHR&R want to prepare communities not just to get back to normal, because normal wasn't working for all families. We want to equip communities for a just recovery, one that achieves economic security for families to be healthy and thrive, no matter where they live or look like. This requires us to be courageous about naming obstacles to health and sharing bold solutions to removing barriers. And with that, here are 3 ways that you can gather information about resources and plan a just recovery for your community. First, plan to attend part 2 of this webinar series. It's scheduled for June 14th. And if you haven't already, be sure to check out our new podcast, In Solidarity, Connecting Power, Place, and Health, produced by our very own Tommy Jaime. Beth Silver and I interview some of the country's most innovative thinkers committed to equity and justice in the podcast. And lastly, did you know that the 2022 County Health Rankings are here? Please check out the data for your county and evidence-rated strategies to help prepare you to move forward. Today's topic of wealth and its connection to health is going to help inform a just recovery. And I'm grateful to have guests joining us today to share their expertise on this topic. So please join me in welcoming Michael Stevenson, a familiar face on our webinars. Michael is the team leader for the Evidence and Policy Analysis team here at CHR&R. Hi, Michael, and thanks for joining us.
Hey, Erica, thank you so much for having me today.
I appreciate you, Michael. And now I want you to join me in welcoming Miriam Axel-Lute, the CEO and editor-in-chief of a phenomenal publication called Shelterforce. This online publication covers the worlds of community development, affordable housing, and equitable development. It helps readers to understand what's required to make community or system-wide changes to those social determinants of health that we know are key to our health outcomes. Hi, Miriam, and thanks for being here today with me.
Hi, Erica. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And yeah, I discovered Shelterforce about 5 years ago, and I've been a big fan ever since. It's a great publication. We will have information about how you can subscribe to it in the resource guide. So be sure to check that out. Check out the resource guide. In a moment, we will hear more from Michael and Miriam, but first I want to share some context about why health is so, this topic of wealth and health is so important to us. I'm going to show you an image of our rankings model. Hopefully this looks familiar to you, but it displays the multiple factors that impact our health. And income is one of those social and economic factors that sit at the foundation of our decisions about health. Income can either expand access and opportunities to health or limit it. And wealth goes beyond just income, as Michael's going to tease out in just a bit. The link between wealth and health outcomes is strong. Studies show that those with greater wealth live longer and enjoy more positive health benefits. Sadly, the converse is also true, so that those with limited to no wealth do not live as long and tend to experience more health problems. Now, I'm sure that what I'm saying to you is not groundbreaking news. You've probably observed this relationship between wealth and health in your own communities. This is clearly an equity issue, as your wealth should not determine your health. So in this webinar, the questions we want to explore are, who is benefiting more from health and who is not? Why are we seeing gaps in health and how can we close the gap? Why are traditional strategies to close wealth gaps are failing? Perhaps this is the question that really intrigues me the most. So this is going to be a really rich discussion. And because this is going to be such a rich discussion, we want you to join us in it. During the video intro, you may have heard about our discussion groups that follow the webinar. They are facilitated by Joanne Lee and are always very engaging. They give you the opportunity to share with and learn from others. So please plan to join us. It's going to happen right after the webinar, and Tommy's going to chat out information at the end of the webinar so you can click and link to that discussion group. Now, Michael, I am going to ask you to rejoin me at the mic. And I want to start by asking, you know, what's the difference between a living wage and wealth? Because I think it's important for us to understand that difference.
Yeah, absolutely, Erica. So these are two important and distinct terms. And it's really important that we understand the difference. So let me start by defining a living wage, which is a measure of income. Living wage is the hourly amount of money that a working individual must earn to cover basic needs. So living wages cover expenses like food or childcare or healthcare and housing. And even though living wages are enough to cover the basics, they aren't enough to invest in wealth building opportunities like owning a home, saving for retirement, or investing in education. When we talk about a household's wealth, we typically are talking about a household's assets. So things like their home, their savings, or their investments, minus any debts that they might have. And wealth is important because it creates more opportunities to receive a good education, to potentially start a small business, to live in well-resourced neighborhoods, or to buy a home that's free from hazards like lead. And also important is that wealth can really provide a safety net when times get tough. And the opportunities wealth can help us access, have the potential really to generate more wealth. And an important note here is that, income can help households acquire assets and avoid debts, but a high income does not necessarily result in greater wealth. So in most cases, especially if wealth has not been passed down between generations, someone must earn, more than a living wage before they can access those wealth building opportunities.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we know that there is a gap between those who hold wealth in this country and those who struggle to earn a living wage. What can we learn from the data?
Yeah, so this map that is on the screen was featured in our national findings report that was released at the end of April. And the map shows the living wage for one adult and two children relative to the median wage in a county. And what's really striking about this map is that there are only a couple counties where the living wage for one adult and two children exceeds the median wage. And this is so few that you probably can't even see them on this map shaded in green. So the darker shades of blue show that in some counties, a wage increase of 2 to 3 times more is needed for one adult and two children. And this means that in nearly every county in the United States, median wages are not meeting basic needs, yet alone creating opportunities for families to build wealth.
Yeah.
But let's talk a little bit about what we know about the wealth distribution in the US. And although we are not able to measure wealth at the county level, the Federal Reserve does collect data on wealth through its survey of consumer finances. But even though our data is a bit more limited, when we look at wealth data by race and ethnicity, we see some really striking disparities in the data. So in the US, Black households have about 10% of the wealth of white households. And the median household wealth is around $188,000 for a white household compared to just over $24,000 for Black households. And I'm going to pause here because it's really important for us to digest these numbers, because I know when I'm watching the news or reading the newspaper, we see images or read stories about wealth, and often we see images of, super yachts or mansions or, really extravagant lifestyles. And, we're not necessarily talking about that kind of wealth when we look at this data. Although, that imagery points to other, wealth inequities that exist. So it's really important that we address, those broader wealth inequities. But the racial wealth gap is especially important because of the systematic ways the gap was created and is maintained.
Yeah, these numbers are shocking to me. I don't know about our audience, but they are shocking to me. Again, like I was saying in the beginning of the webinar, we know that there's a racial wealth gap because we could probably, see it in our communities. I didn't know it was this stark. So, but anyway, maybe I'm the only one, but I'm just shocked by those numbers. How did the racial wealth gap begin, and what are some of the historical drivers that created this gap?
Yeah, so this is a really important question, Erica, and it's really important, especially when we start thinking about solutions, because what I'm about to describe around the drivers of racial wealth inequality show that individual efforts alone cannot overcome the structural barriers that created and maintained the racial wealth divide. And throughout history, we can point to repeated policies and practices that have contributed to the racial wealth divide that we see today. And these policies and practices, many of them sponsored by or supported by the government, helped white households build wealth while oftentimes taking wealth away from Black households. And for us to have this conversation, it's really important that we start at the beginning. And the racial wealth divide began with the forced relocation and genocide of Native communities through the federal government policy. And through colonization, land was forcefully taken from Native communities to increase the wealth of settlers. And the wealth divide continued with the exploitation of slave labor that fueled the US economy for all states, both Northern and Southern. And as we all know, slavery generated wealth for white people at the expense of Black people. And even after emancipation, evidence shows that people of color who accumulated some wealth, repeatedly had it stripped away from them through government action, or violence. So for example, practices like redlining and contract sellers, systematically prevented Black families from buying homes in neighborhoods with resources and increasing property value. People of color were also excluded, though, from benefiting from policies that helped white families make wealth building investments. So, for example, after World War II, the GI Bill supported white veterans in becoming homeowners, but Black veterans were unable to access that benefit because local housing authorities, that implemented the GI Bill really discriminated against Black veterans. And, today we know that home values, serve as one source of wealth for many households. And even as, we move into kind of more contemporary or current times, efforts to reduce discrimination in housing and federal lending, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, were unsuccessful. So national and urban area audits show the persistence of widespread racial discrimination, through practices like discriminatory lending. And evidence also shows that employment discrimination prevented many people of color from accessing employment that paid a good wage, which further entrenched the divide. And today we see how things like exclusionary zoning, a tax code that often benefits or benefits homeowners and those with wealth, and credit exclusion continue to maintain that divide. And Miriam will actually give some examples of that later in this presentation. And what's striking is that these are just a few of the policies and practices that contributed to the racial wealth divide. And in many ways, these policies and practices had compounding effects that built a wall that makes it nearly impossible for Black households to access the same opportunities to build wealth as white households. And if you consider, your community, there are likely, local examples that further contributed to building this wall.
Yeah, and in fact, I would invite you to chat some of those in if you actually know about some of the barriers in your local communities that Michael may not have listed here. But thank you, Michael, for just kind of like sharing the scope of how this happened, from actually before this country was actually a country. So obviously many of us may not have been alive when these policies and systems went into effect, but still there are people benefiting from them today. How is that happening?
Yeah, so I think one of the really important things to remember about wealth is that, it can be passed between generations. And even if you weren't on the receiving end of inheriting wealth, it's possible that your family may have benefited, from some of these policies and practices. And, that doesn't necessarily mean that your family, you would consider them wealthy today. I think across the US, we see that there are so many people hurting right now. And, it's really important to acknowledge that. But even when I look back at my own family, it's really clear how they benefited from some of these policies and practices, that I named here. And I'll give an example. So my grandma Elaine and my grandpa Tom married in 1950. And because my grandpa served in World War II, he was eligible for the GI Bill, which helped them purchase their first and only home, where they raised their 7 children. And they were able to purchase that home in a community where Black families, wouldn't have been able to. And when my grandpa died in 1981, the home provided a sense of stability as my grandma raised her remaining children that were still at home. And the home in some ways, helped her navigate that loss and the financial implications, of losing a spouse. And, my grandma continued to work, but was later able to sell that home to help her, retire with a sense of dignity. And although she didn't die a wealthy woman, or, really with any assets to her name, the GI Bill and the opportunity, my grandparents had to buy a home was really essential to helping her live, well and long. And even though there weren't those material assets that were passed on to her children, homeownership helped my grandma support, her children invest in wealth building activities like getting a quality education.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Michael. And first of all, I love that you talked about your grandmother because I have fond memories of my grandmother as well. But you also talked about you were sharing the fact that sometimes we don't realize how we have benefited today from policies and stuff that weren't necessarily meant um, to to harm your particular family or to take away from a particular, but they were built on the backs of others and they took away opportunities from others. And so thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that. The gap exists and we can close it. How do we begin to do it though? Are there ways to build wealth?
Yes, I think just as we've just talked about, I think the wealth divide was really created over generations and is incredibly complex. And what this means is that there's not a single or a simple solution to really close that racial wealth divide. And I do think though that and evidence supports that there are strategies that can really help account for some of those historical practices that have established and maintained that racial wealth gap. And there are also strategies that can reduce wealth inequities today by, increasing income and assets, expanding employment opportunities, removing barriers to quality education, and increasing access to homeownership. And it's really important here that we don't oversimplify these pathways to build wealth. But what is important is that, communities start conversations about, the drivers of wealth inequity in their community, really imagine, what's possible if these systems were more equitable, and think about ways to reshape those systems both locally and nationally. And I think, just thinking back at the kind of title of this webinar, it's really important to remember that the strategies that can help us build wealth are also strategies that are good for community health. So, research shows that there are a range of factors that influence how well and how long we live. So things like access to a good paying job or safe and affordable housing or quality education, are really important to our health. But they're also, key factors in building wealth. And even though that connection between wealth and health isn't perfect, for example, wealth doesn't protect people from experiencing discrimination or racism, which have negative impacts on our health. There are things that we can do that are good for both our health, and our wealth.
Yeah, and that leads me to this next question, because I know that we here at CHRNR have been thinking about that question of how do we close the racial wealth gap. We've been thinking about it a lot, actually, and we're addressing it again in this webinar, but also in the podcast in solidarity. But I know that what works for health is turning a spotlight on this as well. So share a little bit more about this resource that folks can use, like you said, as they begin to sit down and have those conversations about what's happening in their community.
Yeah, so just a few weeks ago in April, we launched a new curated list of strategies that communities can explore to help close the racial wealth gap. And in addition to highlighting over 30 existing What Works for Health strategies, we added several new strategies to What Works for Health. And I'll give you a couple examples of some that were added. The first is universal basic income, which is a strategy that provides regular cash transfers to households to cover basic needs. We also added 2 new reparation strategies. And these strategies often include formal government apologies, and either provide direct payments to descendants of enslaved people or help create some pathways to homeownership for people of color. One strategy that we're hearing a lot about right now in different spaces is baby bonds, and we added a baby bond strategy to What Works for Health to really examine, what is the evidence behind this strategy. And baby bonds help establish publicly funded investment accounts for newborns. And those accounts grow over a child's lifetime. And at 18, they're able to use those investments to invest in wealth building activities, like put it towards a down payment on a house or invest it in a college education. So we're really excited about some of these new strategies that we've added to this list. But when we look at this list, it's also really important, again, to remember that there's not one single solution that will close the gap by itself. And these solutions can be a really powerful place start to think about the type of change that you want to see in your community.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Michael. I really, really appreciate it. And for those of you who just heard him talk about baby bonds, we are going to have a guest with us next month to give us more information about baby bonds and how they are helping to close the racial wealth divide. So make sure you're here next month. Thank you, Michael, for the teaser that I didn't even realize you were going to put in there by talking about baby bonds. So great. With that, I want you to stick around, obviously. Oh, no. You actually want to talk a little bit more about the podcast. So please do that.
Yeah, Erica, you mentioned it at the top of the webinar, but we also released a new podcast in the last month or so called In Solidarity, Connecting Power, Place, and Health. And the podcast is really based on the idea of social solidarity, that we're all connected in ways that impact our day-to-day lives, and importantly, our fates, whether it's obvious or not. So in our first mini series, we dig deeper into the racial wealth divide. And Erica, you know this because you're one of the co-hosts with our colleague Beth. You interviewed some incredible guests for this series. And these include people like Dr. Christine Muganda from County Health Rankings and Roadmaps, who many of you have seen as a guest on the webinar series. But we also feature interviews with other scholars and experts like Donald Cohen, who wrote a book about how in this country we've moved from public goods to privatizing everything. We also talked to scholars like Dr. Dalton Connolly, a professor and author from Princeton, Dr. Andre Perry, an author and scholar from the Brookings Institution, and Latresa McLaughlin-Ryan, who is the executive director of the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative.
Yeah, and what Michael is too humble to share with you all is that we also interviewed him. And as you can see, Michael has a lot to share about how we can address the racial wealth divide. Obviously, be sure to check out Michael's interview along with the others, dynamic brains in this series. And Michael, thank you. I'm going to circle back to you later some questions that are popping up. So thanks for sharing for now. And, one of the baby steps toward closing the racial wealth divide is home ownership. Yet, even home ownership is not the panacea we're quite looking for to solve this deep divide in wealth. So, it's one of the reasons why we invited Miriam to join us to break all of this down for us. So, Miriam, welcome back. And there's some in our audience today who may be new to the Shelterforce publication. Can you share more about it?
Sure thing. Thanks, Erica. So Shelterforce is a national nonprofit publication, and we cover housing justice, affordable housing, and community development. We're an online publication, and we cover the wide range of things that might go into improving not just housing, but the other sort of physical parts that go into making a healthy community. And we actually have a health desk because we realized a few years ago that even though we weren't using the terms, that everything we were writing about was in fact social determinants of health. And Shelterforce was founded in 1975 by tenant organizers in New Jersey. They wanted to reach out to other tenant organizers and find out what they were doing. And it has grown from there and become something of a staple within the affordable housing world. And people use it to have independent conversations that aren't attached to a particular strategy, to find out what's happening in other parts of the country, keep up to date, and use our content also to advocate to other people and help other people understand what's going on in the housing world.
Yeah, thank you so much. Again, we're going to have a link to this publication in the resource guide because it really is it's very illuminating. And we heard from Michael a few moments ago, Miriam, that there are pathways to building wealth. Yet in your publication and other reports and studies, they're showing that even with pathways to wealth, racial gaps persist. So again, there's plenty of data around this. Why is the gaps persisting? Why is this happening?
Well, one of the main reasons that it's persisting is that, as Michael so clearly showed, the wealth gap was created by a long history of race-conscious policies that were very focused and direct. And the thing is, as he also mentioned, wealth is generational and wealth creates more wealth. So when you have a large disparity in place, if all you do is remove the things that caused it and proceed with supposedly race-neutral policies from there, that's not going to be enough to make it go away, because the folks with disparately more wealth are not holding steady to wait for you to catch up. And this is especially true because we tax wealth than income, which then further advantages those who started off with more. The more you have, the more you get.
Right.
Secondly, one of the key formal, while some of the key formal things like redlining and federal housing agency discrimination, restrictive covenants on housing deeds, those are officially gone. There are still multiple ways that current racism and that legacy of past racism is still actively detracting from the wealth of people of color or preventing it from being built, especially Black and Indigenous Americans. And I noted, very impressed in the chat, a lot of people observed what some of these were and their relationship to wealth. So legal system fines and fees are an example. And there was a lot of folks bringing up the legal system among all the many problems that we're aware of with discrimination in the legal system. There's a whole bunch of fines and fees that are often handed down and that keep people from building assets, involve garnishing wages and making it difficult to build up a down payment. The predatory marketing of for-profit schools in communities of color is another example, ending up with folks having far more student debt than others. So there's a lot of ways in which that gap is still actively being created.
Yeah, ways that we're not really even thinking about are constantly influencing our ability to purchase or secure wealth, I should say. We do talk about home ownership as being a pathway, but it just isn't enough. Why isn't it just enough?
I think one of the main problems when we talk about homeownership is that as a solution in the wealth space is that we talk about just the need to increase access to it. And that's not enough for two main reasons. First, again, like other wealth building strategies, it works better as a way to build wealth for those who already have some substantial wealth. If you have the access to a larger down payment, you get better terms on your loan, you're better able to weather a crisis, have more money to put into maintenance and repairs, more access to buying in places that are more likely to appreciate, less likely to have lead and health hazards. And so we have a correlation causation problem where we assume that because some folks are getting a certain amount of wealth out of their home ownership, that everybody else will be able to do that too. And I want to be very clear that this doesn't mean low-income people can't be successful homeowners. They can, especially with safe and responsible loans. But on average, the data shows it doesn't show their wealth, doesn't grow their wealth as fast, let alone faster to close a gap. So it's important to remember that while there is a racial homeownership gap, people of color, especially Black households, that was on that last slide, actually already have much more of the wealth that they do own concentrated in homeownership already. Yeah. And White households tend to have their assets more diversified. And homeownership is a more challenging form of wealth to access when you need it with high transaction costs.
Right. So what we're seeing, before you move on, so what we're seeing in this slide, am I interpreting right by saying typically that is the only wealth, the only asset rather, that Black families may have?
Yes, or at least the major one, exactly.
Yeah.
So the other reason that homeownership isn't enough, or access to homeownership isn't enough, is that there's ongoing effects, racist policies and attitudes that affect how well homeownership works to provide financial benefit to homeowners of color. And so when you have discrimination in credit scores, discrimination in interest rates, discrimination in refinancing approvals, appraisal bias and appraisal gaps, bias in property tax assessments, all these things pile up to make the financial benefit of homeownership harder, and there's less of it. And there's hard evidence on each one of these things that they're happening and affecting homeowners of color. Now, again, doesn't mean homeownership is bad. There are lots of benefits to it and other reasons to do it, but it means it's not going to fix the wealth disparity until we fix it. And I like to use the metaphor, if we're looking at it as a race course, what was happening before is that households of color weren't even allowed to get on the racetrack. But now they're there, but there's a bunch of obstacles in the way that are making access unfair.
Yeah. What are some policies and practices that are continuing to feed this racial divide? I mean, you've talked about some of them, but I think it's important for us to know that there are some policies and practices that's not even actually intended to do harm, but they are. Let's talk about that.
Absolutely. And that's a really important thing to recognize. So I'm just going to list a few of them. There are many more, but I mentioned credit scores briefly. Credit scores are technically supposed to be race neutral. In fact, they were supposed to be an improvement over having a biased loan officer just saying no to any applicants of color. But you build credit under this system by having credit, by having something to make a payment on. If you don't have parents who are going to co-sign an initial credit card for you to build that loan, if you don't have access to down payment to have an early home ownership or take some other kind of loan, you're not likely to build that credit score. Also, people living in areas that have been redlined, discriminated against, are often have predatory financial products marketed to them. They're redlining in terms of insurance, end up more likely to have had payment issues that don't actually speak to their ability to handle a fair and reasonable loan. Another example that comes up frequently is referring to the Fair Housing Act and saying, because of the Fair Housing Act, we have to be race neutral in all things housing, and we can't do anything to make up for past government discrimination. And again, that's counter to the purpose of the act, which was to advance actual fair housing and integration. But lots of people bring it up and say, we can't do any of that. Now, there is actually, you are allowed to make special purpose credit loans programs that are targeted to populations that have been disadvantaged, but folks are very hesitant to do that. Another example that seems race neutral is using neighborhood comparisons for appraisals. So even if your appraiser is not biased, and unfortunately many of them are, but even if they are not, if they're using other properties in a neighborhood that has been segregated for their comparisons, they're going to be replicating a previous patterns of negative bias on those appraisals, which becomes a cycle that goes forward. And one suggestion folks have made to fix that is to use a metropolitan-wide comparison of similar homes rather
than just the neighborhood. Yeah.
It's a challenge.
Yeah. Now, what about the tax code? I mean, let's talk about that.
Right, it's everywhere. And so Dorothy Brown wrote a book recently called The Whiteness of Wealth, in which she explores this really well. And just one small example that really stuck out to me is that, so we know that there's these appraisal biases, we know that segregation exists. When you go into the tax code, if your house appreciates and you have capital gains on your house when you sell it, there's tax benefits. A certain amount of that is not taxed. But if your house depreciates, you get no tax benefit from that. If you lose money on stocks, you do. If you lose money on a business, you do. But if your house depreciates, you have no tax benefits from that. So it's, again, reinforcing the disparity that's already there.
Right. Particularly since you just said, for most Black families or people of color, their one large asset is their home. It's not, they don't have the ability to diversify their wealth into other ways, like stocks that you said, like would, be okay if they lost value. So, all of us on this webinar are advocates for better health outcomes for everyone. And, Michael so clearly articulated that link between the health and it's between wealth and health. So, because wealth is so tied to health, what can we do as public health advocates to begin closing the wealth gap?
Great. Well, there are many things. And first, I would say it's important to understand how we got there, which we're working on today, and the difference between individual solutions and systemic solutions, and making sure that you are including the latter. It's fine and necessary to support individuals while we do the work of changing systems, but it shouldn't be put forward as the large-scale solution. These were systemic causes, and we need systemic solutions. Secondly, I would say be sure not to ignore extraction and fixing that. So it's very easy and friendly. So we want to build assets. We want to help people have homeownership in business. It's positive. It's bipartisan. But if we're doing that without stopping the ways in which we're pulling wealth away from communities of color, it's not going to work. And so we need to do the hard work of looking at these extractive processes, the legal system, the student debt, the medical debt, the predatory financial products, and addressing those as well. I would also suggest examine the ways in which your institution might be relying on apparently race-neutral policies that are actually making things worse. Are you using credit scores for things that you don't need to be? Are you relying on irrelevant legal system involvement records in hiring decisions? Are you focusing on individual behaviors rather than policies that would bring more amenities to previously segregated neighborhoods? Is your health system lobbying for structural changes to housing, financial systems, debt relief, legal system things? And finally, speaking from Shelterforce, I want to suggest that you don't have to become an expert in all things housing. become coalition partners with people who are working in housing and community development, because there's a lot of ways that you can support each other without having to become a housing developer, a tenant organizer. And Shelterforce's health desk has done a lot of writing about those kind of partnerships. And the slide here shows one article we did about how to connect. Now, this is aimed, the headline is aimed at the housing side, how to connect with your public health department, but this article is actually good for folks in either type of organization to look at the ways in which they can connect with each other.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And we here at County Health Rankings and Roadmaps always stress the importance of multi-sectoral partnerships and making sure that those that represent community development are at the table in those discussions. And if they're not, go and talk to them and reach out to them, because people in community development are eager to connect with those of us who are in public health, because they, just like Miriam said, like, we realize, like, oh my gosh, we're actually doing health with the work that we do. So make sure you be the bridge to community development with the work that you do. And as you can see, Shelterforce is amazing. So there are folks I'm sure have got some questions in the Q&A box for you, Miriam. Again, you're going to have that opportunity to subscribe to this wonderful publication. Just make sure you look in your resource guide. And right now, I'm going to ask James to launch a quick poll. We want to hear from you and our audience. We're curious if you plan to use any of the resources shared today to deepen your understanding of the racial wealth divide. Those resources include the podcast. It includes the curated list that Michael was talking about. And of course, it includes the webinar series. So just let us know whether or not you feel like they will be useful to you. This is an anonymous poll and your responses are only going to be shared with us. We're just curious to see if these resources are practical and useful for you. So James, you can go ahead and close that poll in 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much, James.
Sure thing.
Now I'm going to pause and ask Joanne to come to the mic and let us know what's bouncing up.
Thanks, Erica. So the Q&A box has been very, very active, which is what we like, because it's an indicator that our presenters did a wonderful job in getting people to really think about this topic, right? And more importantly, what can they do about it? And so we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can, but I do want to say, if you submitted a question in the Q&A box, Michael has been very helpful in trying to address some of those. So in case we don't get to your question live, make sure you check back in the Q&A box to see if yours was addressed online. So I am going to start with Michael, because we actually had a few folks just appalled at some of the data that you shared about the inequities around wealth. And a lot of folks wanted to know about trends. What are we seeing in terms of, are the inequities going up? Is it getting better, or is it actually getting worse?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and it's not a simple answer. And so what I'll actually do is point people to the Survey of Consumer Finances, which has a really nice summary, and I can actually put it in the chat. But what we're seeing is that the trends, there are some minor shifts when we look at wealth across a number of demographic characteristics, whether that's education or housing status or race, ethnicity, but the gaps are pretty persistent, and in some cases the gaps are growing. So we're seeing some movement around certain groups making some headway, but the data is really kind of complex, and there's a really nice summary from the the Survey of Consumer Finances that I'll put in the chat for folks to check out.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. You mentioned, both of you mentioned so many factors that are not only contributing to the wealth gap, but compounding it. And folks, I think there are a few that are really interested in the way education is set up in our country. So, if either of you could speak on the role of educational attainment, and particularly, Miriam, you mentioned student debt, can you say a little bit more about how that's contributing and some potential solutions around education?
Sure, and I'd be interested to have Michael weigh in as well. So student debt has been, as I said, if we look at the numbers, and I don't have a slide to pull up, but we do have an article that we recently read on this, it is disproportionately affecting people of color, especially Black students. And there are many factors to that. One of them is the targeted marketing from for-profit schools, which have a much lower graduation rate and higher costs. But one of the important things to know also is that just like with homeownership, if you look at educational attainment, there's still a wealth gap within the folks who have the same level of educational attainment. So everybody should have access to higher education, but it by itself is not enough to close the wealth gap. White folks with much lower levels of education still have higher amounts of wealth. So it's not a quick fix, but it is something certainly that we need to roll into our larger strategies.
Yeah, I can make one comment on that. And Kirsten Frobaum, who's an analyst on our team, had shared this with me just as we were prepping for the webinar. And this comes from Dr. Andre Perry's work, who's actually one of our podcast guests. And, I think just again, show how all these things are connected. So we see that generational wealth gap play out in terms of who holds student debt today. So while policies like the GI Bill, that we've talked about, allowed white families over several generations help their kids go to school and go to college, Black students were less likely to have accrued that family wealth. And as a result, Black households have more student debt compared to white households, regardless of their income level. And Black individuals with a college degree have lower rates of homeownership than whites who hold less than a high school diploma. And so again, the connection between the data that we're seeing today, the historical drivers of kind of what established and helped maintain the gap are just so significant. And again, this work comes from Dr. Perry, who's one of our podcast guests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for reminding us that everything's so interconnected. And so part of the solution forward is to make sure we sort of untangle some of these things and tackle them with some promising strategies. I also want to point out that some of the information that you all shared about especially the wage gaps, our audience was relating that to disparities in gender pay as well. Just wanted to note that. This is a big question. I want to, and so I'll just put it out there because I think it's an interesting one as well. But somebody wanted to hear both of your thoughts on the role that capitalism might play in terms of the wealth inequities and disparities.
Start? I mean, it's fundamental, right? There's a reason that many people call it racialized capitalism, right? The way that we look at race in this country was developed and created and implemented in order to divide working class white folks from Africans and then enslaved Africans. It's entirely intentional. It's a way to keep folks from focusing on the real problem, the elites, a way to keep folks from organizing together against the forces that hold the capital. As someone said in the chat, exactly, capitalism requires a lower class to function. And so they're intimately connected.
Want to add anything, Michael?
I think Miriam covered that well.
Okay, so let's sort of switch to something of hope. When you look, seeing how big the problem is, and knowing that there are folks who really are working towards solutions to decreasing the inequities here, what would each of you say has been the most hopeful thing that's maybe happened in recent times to address this issue?
I can start here just because I'm off mute. I mean, I think there's some really promising examples that communities are leading around how to acknowledge past harms and then to actually implement some solutions to mitigate some of those harms. So we see communities like Washington DC or the state of Connecticut passing baby bond legislation that again establishes kind of investment accounts for newborns that will grow over the course of 18 years, and that kids can essentially invest in wealth building opportunities. I think the way we're talking about the issue and thinking about solutions brings me a lot of hope. Again, none of the solutions are that simple. A baby bond alone likely won't close the racial wealth divide, but it's a really promising first step.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's extremely promising that there's a wider understanding right now that what we're seeing is coming directly from this long history of intentional actions, and that it's not due to just differences in folks' patterns. So that's hopeful, because it leads us to, okay, so we can make intentional changes. I'm seeing a lot more people willing to talk about race conscious policy, willing to go in and talk about changing the way that they do things. I think that things like Fannie Mae looking at rent payments as part of qualifying for a mortgage, those kind of changes, while they're wonky, are more important to some extent than a special fund over here for that covers a small amount of people. So these changes, structural changes in the way we do things, I find helpful. But I still think, also for any change this large, we're going to need movements and organizing. And so I find the organizing that has been happening over the past couple of years hopeful.
Thank you both. And I know, Erica, we have to move on, but I just want to put in another pitch. I know there are other folks who are entering questions in the Q&A. Come on over to the post-webinar discussion group where we will have Michael and Miriam joining us, and we can continue this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joanne. Joanne is actually getting ready to go over and open up that room right now. And I just wanted to echo my appreciation for all of you who have been so vocal in the chat. During this Q&A period, I was kind of perusing through some of what you have chatted in. Some of the responses have been just absolutely shocking. And so I'm learning so much by this series and learning so much by connecting with people like you in the community doing the hard work of creating equity. Thank you so much for all that you do. And Tommy right now is chatting a link to our feedback survey. I'm curious about, we're always curious about whether or not we're meeting your needs with our webinars. A lot of our topics are designed specifically for what you are asking for. Believe me, I hear you when you say you want more information on rural community health and rural resilience. We will be actually doing more webinars around that topic, but let us know what you want to hear more about. So take that survey. So we appreciate listening and hearing feedback from you. Next month, we are going to conclude this series on unjust and unfair health consequences of a racial wealth divide. And we're going to explore solutions. So we'll be spending a lot of time. This webinar is more like, how did we get here? Why is this persisting? Why is this happening? But next month, we're going to definitely be squarely in the solutions bucket. So we're going to explore solutions that are working to close the racial wealth divide. And we're going to hear from Shara Markov at Prosperity Now, who's going to talk to us about baby bonds. She's going to go into much more detail than we've been able to share here about how they work. How do they benefit people? How do they actually benefit the communities or the states that are issuing them? So we're going to hear all that detail. Then we're also going to hear from Kiana Walston in Rocky Mount, the city of Rocky Mount, North Carolina, that actually has a wealth building initiative that is centered around home ownership. Remember, home ownership is still a really good pathway for families to build wealth. So we're going to hear about the work that they've been doing in Rocky Mount. And I also want to add, they are a recent winner of the RWJF Culture of Health Prize. So please join us next month for that. I just learned that the registration for that particular webinar on June 14th will be posted tomorrow. So you'll be able to sign up. Now, for the discussion group, please just go ahead and hop on over there right now. Tommy's chatting a link to that, and Joanne has opened the room. I will be there shortly, so please join Miriam, Michael, Joanne, and I as we kind of break down some of the things that you've heard and also hear about what's happening in your community. Don't forget to stay in touch with us. The best way is to sign up for our newsletter. And if you did not catch that QR code to sign up for the newsletter, it should be on our outro video. If not, it will be in your resource guide. So with that, I just want to thank you for sharing your afternoon with us, and we'll see you next month.